It's a pleasure to be here, and I would recommend Mehdi's paper very much to all of you. Mehdi is one of the few people in town who everything he writes, I read. I find him to be incredibly insightful, and I think you'll find this paper to be incredibly insightful. When Ahmadinejad came to power in 2005, he really redefined Iran's political spectrum. For example, someone like Ali Larijani, who 10 years ago was being defined in the Western media as an arch hardliner, became a moderate after Ahmadinejad came to office in 2005. And I see from Mehdi's paper that Ahmadinejad also redefined Iran's aesthetic spectrum, because on page 13 of his report, Mehdi refers to Khamenei as good-looking, something which he had never been accused of before. But joking aside, there was a few important themes I wanted to touch upon in his paper, and then maybe pose a question to Dennis and to Mehdi about the policy implications of those themes. And one of the overarching arguments that Mehdi makes in his paper is that Khamenei is essentially unengageable. It's an exercise in futility to try to engage Khamenei. And if you read Mehdi's op-ed in the Wall Street Journal last week, he makes a very similar argument. So I thought, in honor of Dennis being the moderator, I would try to provide some context to that assertion that Khamenei is unengageable. And after Khomeini dies in 1989, I would argue that the custodianship of the Islamic Republic is left to two individuals, Hashemi Rafsanjani, who becomes president, and Khamenei, who becomes supreme leader. And I would say there was two broad schools of thought post-Khomeini. And the first school of thought was Rafsanjani and the pragmatists, who were loyal soldiers of the revolution. And they believed that in order to preserve the Islamic Republic, they needed to reform the Islamic Republic. The focus needed to be on opening up the country's economy, easing social freedoms, and keeping the political space to themselves, but basically pursuing a China model of sorts. And Rafsanjani in some ways fashioned himself an Iranian version of Deng Xiaoping. And the opposite school of thought, the so-called principalists, I believe is best represented by Khamenei. And Khamenei believed that if the Islamic Republic were to start compromising on its revolutionary ideals, it could unravel the entire system. And what was very instructive for him was the experience of Gorbachev in the Soviet Union. His takeaway from that was that when Gorbachev started to compromise on the Soviet Union's ideals, that's when the entire system collapsed. So you basically had these two schools of thought. One was aspirations of being like China, the Rafsanjani school, and fears of becoming like the Soviet Union, which was the Khamenei school. And I would argue that the Khamenei school has clearly prevailed. And there was an interesting quote I caught from Khamenei over the weekend. The leader of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, had visited Tehran, and he was giving Haniyeh some advice, and he said to him, quote, "Always be wary of infiltration by compromisers in a resistance organization." And I think in many ways, the Islamic Republic under Khamenei fashions itself a resistance regime. And it's a resistance regime not for the gratuitous sake of being ideological for being ideological, but its ideology, I should say, it's driven by self-preservation, but cloaked in ideology. Meaning the argument that so many people have made over the years that if we engage Iran, we engage Khamenei, and reintegrate him into the global economy and into the international political order, this is going to facilitate political reform in Tehran. I don't disagree with that argument, but I think we were all naive to think that Khamenei would be oblivious to that argument, and he would embark on a path which could weaken himself and be inimical to his own interests. So broadly speaking, I share Mehdi's skepticism about our ability to meaningfully engage Iran as long as Ayatollah Khamenei remains supreme leader. Now, Mehdi's takeaway from that argument is that we should start to reach out to the Revolutionary Guards. The Revolutionary Guards have eclipsed the clergy over the last decade or so in terms of their economic power and influence, and they do have tremendous business interests in Iran. Mehdi asserts in his paper they control up to 1/3 of the Iranian economy, and the business interests of the Revolutionary Guards are increasingly being frustrated by the sanctions which Iran is currently enduring. So Mehdi's argument is that we somehow try to reach out to these Revolutionary Guards who are in positions of influence and are likely to be in positions of even greater influence after Khamenei leaves. The question I will pose to all of you, to Dennis, to Mehdi, is that in the late 90s, the Clinton administration had reached a somewhat similar conclusion, and that they believed that it was futile to reach out to Ayatollah Khamenei, but there was an opening with the reformists in Tehran, with Mohammad Khatami. And the Clinton administration did actually make a concerted effort to reach out to the reformers in Iran. And they were frustrated by Khamenei, who essentially put the kibosh on it. And now the Obama administration has tried to reach out to the person in charge, or tried to reach out directly to Khamenei. I would argue they made unprecedented overtures, which Khamenei, for the reasons I described earlier, wasn't able to reciprocate. So it seems to me that that's going to be a difficult endeavor, to reach out to Revolutionary Guardsmen who have been basically handpicked by Khamenei over the years. He's essentially handpicked their top few tiers of Rev Guard commanders, and he shuffles them somewhat frequently in order to prevent them from acquiring their own power base. And so that seems, as a policy prescription, something which is going to be very challenging. You know, how do we reach out to these Revolutionary Guardsmen at the expense of Khamenei, these individuals whom Khamenei himself has selected? So in a way, the dilemma we have with Iran reminds me of this old dilemma which the Dutch philosopher Erasmus talked about when he was rebuffed by a woman in a moment of misogyny. He said, women, we can't live with them and we can't live without them. And likewise, I think Ayatollah Khamenei is someone whom we can't live with. He's very difficult to engage, but I don't see how we live without him, meaning it's going to be very difficult, I believe, to reach any type of a meaningful and binding compromise with Iran absent Khamenei's signature on it. And my take is somewhat similar to Mehdi in that I believe it's going to be very difficult to engage Khamenei and compel him to make compromises. But I do believe that this regime is now faced with an unprecedented level of international pressure and popular disaffection. And I think that if Khamenei calculates that, I see basically for 22 years since he's come to power, I guess not 23 years, Khamenei has been someone who's tried to eschew transformative decisions. He's wanted to preserve the status quo, and in order to do that, he's avoided making transformative decisions. And I see Khamenei's back increasingly against the wall now with these sanctions, and I see that he has two decisions increasingly before him, both of which would be transformative for Iran. And the first decision is to make a compromise with the United States, to make a nuclear compromise. And the second decision is to go for a nuclear weapon. And there are a variety of reasons we've talked about earlier why he's not amenable to compromise, both in terms of his own worldview and the lesson he's drawn from the experience of Libya, for example. He believes that after Gaddafi gave up his nuclear program, he made himself vulnerable to outside intervention. But I do think that if we try to get inside the head of the leader, and he thinks that Iran is at least 2-3 years away, minimum, from being able to acquire a nuclear weapon. And it's not going to be a straight line to acquiring a nuclear weapon, meaning Iran's nuclear sites have likely been penetrated by foreign intelligence. Khamenei may calculate to himself that it's going to be difficult to endure the current level of pressure. And it's not going to be the current level, it's going to be an escalating level of international pressure and the time it will take for the regime to acquire a nuclear weapon. And I think that is increasingly going to be his calculations. And I would just, I'll close by going back to Mehdi's paper and the topic of succession. And I think what Dennis prefaced his comments by saying that, it's very unclear whether there will even be a supreme leader who succeeds Khamenei. And I think that's very true. But I would say that if there is indeed going to be a supreme leader who succeeds Khamenei, it increasingly seems to me that there is a building consensus around Ayatollah Shahroudi, who was the former head of the judiciary. And he's kind of become to the Iran supreme leader discussion what Mitt Romney has become to the GOP debate, and that he's kind of the default option, the least of bad options. And he's someone who has, he's a bona fide Ayatollah, and he's someone with a bureaucratic experience as well. So I'll leave it there and look forward to your questions. Thank you.